The 28 series of U-boat locomotives built by GE can easily be lumped together in one massive category, as well as the 30 series which superseded it. The reason being is that they all basically came at around the same time, and shared very similar visual traits. The U28C, for example, debuted in 1965, in December of that year specifically, creating, as the name implies, 2800 horsepower with again an FDL 16 prime mover. Early editions of this locomotive looked exactly like U25Bs, only obviously containing, as per the C designation, 6-axle trucks. Unfortunately, none of these engines survive, all were scrapped. The next model in the 28 series was known as the U28CG, introduced in July of 1966 and continued in production until August of 66. This model is of interest as it was a passenger variant of the U-boats. Ordered by the Santa Fe Railroad, which by this point had phased out its Alco PAs and whose F-series locomotives were really starting to show their age with chronic mechanical failure and other reliability issues becoming, well, chronic. The Santa Fe, of course, having plenty of pride in its operations, was not about to subject its passengers to such issues if it could avoid it. And so, despite the late date in the late 60s, decided to order 10 of these units to supplement and or replace its F units. These locomotives looked a lot like the U28Cs, the main difference being is they had a little extended section on the rear of the unit to house the steam generator to steam heat the old passenger coaches. They were also re-geared for passenger service. Unfortunately, these locomotives didn't do all that well. They had a terrible reputation for derailments, and after a few severe derailments on the main line, the company promptly pulled them from service and reinstated its F units. These locomotives would serve out their years on the Santa Fe in freight service. All were scrapped, none survive. The next locomotive in the 28 series of U-boats from GE is the U28B. Introduced in January of 1966 and ending production in December of 1966, 148 of these locomotives were built. Again, as its name implies, the unit was part of the U series as per U, 28 standing for 2800 horsepower, and B in this case standing for 4-axle trucks, instead of the C trucks as of the previous models discussed. Out of the 148 of these locomotives produced, few of these still exist, and fewer of these are in operating service. More on this later. An interesting quirk on this particular model, as well as a lot of these Seri that would come out in subsequent years from GE, is the fact that it looked much like, at least in its early production, like its predecessor, the U25B, with the humps on the rear of the locomotive all being in place, as well as the unstreamlined nose and the separated cab window. These would later be replaced by the newer, more modern streamlined cab style, as well as additional streamlining on the body, with the humps on the rear of the locomotive being removed and made flat. The next locomotive to debut as part of GE's U series of locomotives, or Universal Series as it was also known as, was the U30B. Again, the U stood for the U series, the 30 stood for 3,000 horsepower, and the B stood for 4-axle trucks. The locomotive debuted in May of 1966, and production lasted all the way until March of 1975, with a total of 295 built. The next locomotive GE would build in its U-boat series would be the U30C, essentially a 6-axle version of the U30B. Production started in November of 1966 and ended in September of 1976, with a total of 600 units produced. A massive improvement in terms of production numbers for GE, but as we'll find, GM still had GE over a barrel, so to speak. Santa Fe would, again, with more failures of its F units and continuous problems with the U28CGs, and apparently because it had so much good luck with the U28CGs, would go back to GE and request a new type passenger locomotive built, essentially based upon the U30C, referred to as the U30CG. This locomotive is essentially a stock U30C with a cowl body designed to be more pleasurable to look at for the passenger traveler. The concept again by the Santa Fe was to try to keep its passengers happy by avoiding delays being caused by the older EMD F units at the time, as well as the unreliable U28CGs. Only 6 of these units were produced between November 1967 and December of 1967. All were scrapped, finishing their lives out once again as freight locomotives for the company. The issue being, again, derailments as well as unreliability and apparently reported fires on these locomotives due to some electrical problems they experienced. One of the most notable traits of GE's U-boats is how the first in a series often look like the previous in a series. For example, the U28B seen above looks exactly like a U25B, as we now see above. The only differences are internally, and these are the modifications to the prime mover to make it make 2,800 horsepower instead of 2,500 as on the U25B. And this brings me neatly and segues me and/or neatly to the reason why I put these locomotives in the same video. The fact of the matter is, if a unit was purchased as a U28B, it was not very difficult to upgrade it to 3,000 horsepower later on in life, nor were the costs, which were negligible, as the parts were made very easily available by GE. Also, telling these locomotives apart from one another can be very difficult, as a later production of one model became the newer production of the next model, and vice versa. Making things even more complicated was the fact that many railroads would take to simply upgrading all of these locomotives to 3,000 or above horsepower. The main reason being is it's always easier to assign locomotives with the same horsepower to a train, and further increases in horsepower would allow the railroad companies to haul more tonnage with fewer locomotives required. While sales of these new GE U-boats were certainly better than that of Alco's at the time, we'll get into this in a moment, this is again mainly due to GE's great customer support, which of course in this case once again meant laying out cash in very large quantities, destroying the company's profit margins. This would become a sticking point in later years for the U-boat series. But for the time being, GE was just doing whatever it could to get as much market share as possible, as it was betting its locomotive division on this being the secret to getting control of the North American diesel locomotive production market. It's important to note that Alco was not standing still during this period in time. It introduced its new Alco Century C425, specifically to compete with the former model, the U25B, in 1964. While this was a little bit later in terms of the date when this particular engine debuted, it was done to satisfy a request from a railroad that wanted to match the U25B's total horsepower output. Alco would attempt to counter GE's U28C with its own model C628. As the name implies, and one would think it implies, this unit had 6 axles and made 2,800 horsepower. However, this wasn't quite the case. A 16-cylinder 251 prime mover employed to propel this locomotive and that was installed underneath the hood of this locomotive could only produce 2,750 horsepower. Production lasted from 1963 to 1968, and only 186 of these units were built. The locomotive was very clearly a third, and very distant third at that, in the production market, but this would prove to be nothing compared to the huge lead EMD was about to get. Alco would also counter GE's U30C with its own model, C630, in 1965. Only 133 of these locomotives were produced between 1965 and 1968, again, paling in comparison to the whopping 600 U36Cs GE managed to sell around the same time. Alco would also attempt to counter the U30C with its own C430 model, produced in July of 1966 and ending production of February of 1968. Unfortunately, only 16 of these locomotives were produced. It appeared that GE's costly but still effective customer relations and/or warranty support program was still having a very dramatic effect and doing its job in getting GE the number 2 position in locomotive production. Or was it? In 1961, EMD introduced its GP30 model, which sold a whopping 948 units. To put this in perspective, that number was actually more than all of the U-boats on the U25B all the way through the U30 series combined. Interestingly enough, this was despite the fact that the locomotive failed to make 3,000 horsepower. It only produced 2,250 horsepower. This is significant as this locomotive was introduced to compete with GE's U30B, which of course produced exactly 3,000 horsepower. The 30 in the name GP30 was actually representative of the 30 improvements the model had against its predecessor from GM. The GP30 achieved its 2,250 horsepower with a 567D3 prime mover, again with 16 cylinders and turbocharging. And if you thought the GP30 did well, just take a gander at the GP35. Introduced in July of 1963 and lasting in production until January of 1966, which sold a whopping 1,334 units. It managed to achieve 2,500 horsepower with the same 567 prime mover, in this case the B variant of that particular engine, which was again turbocharged and had 16 cylinders. Both of these locomotives were far less fuel efficient than the GE models as well as the Alco models, in addition to not matching Alco or GE for horsepower, and yet they outsold them noticeably based upon EMD's reputation for reliability. And again, fuel prices hadn't come up yet, and railroads were still more than willing to, as long as these prices remained at their current levels, to spend a little bit more on fuel if it meant getting more reliability. For understandable reasons, EMD would continue to focus on reliability for its succeeding models. For example, the GP38, which was introduced in 1966, was the debut locomotive for the new 645 prime mover, which would finally get EMD up to its horsepower targets. However, this locomotive was rated much more conservatively at 2,000 horsepower. The concept here was to essentially provide a testbed for the new prime mover and get ahead of any problems. Something Alco really should have considered doing when it introduced its infamous 244 prime mover years before, which would essentially doom the company in the long run. EMD would then introduce the locomotive that would finally allow it to match the horsepower ratings of GE's products and become its flagship for years to come. The model would be known as the SD40. Part of EMD's SD or Special Duty series, it had 6 axles instead of 4. What made this locomotive so spectacular was the prime mover it utilized, a 645E, now rated at 3,000 horsepower, again achieving this with 16 cylinders and turbocharging. Sales of this locomotive reflected that, a whopping 1,268, and EMD was just getting started with this one. And if you thought this particular locomotive was great, in 1972, EMD rolled out its SD40-2 variant, making again 3,000 horsepower, but selling a whopping 3,982 locomotives. Wow! And this model and its sisters becoming the locomotive railroads bought at the time. And I'm not just saying, again, a locomotive, but the locomotive. Essentially, you looked on railroads in the 80s, and if you watched vintage railroading films, you'll find that these engines were pretty much everywhere. And this continued to exist well into the 90s, and even now to a certain extent in the 2000s, because of how efficient this prime mover was compared to its predecessor, and how reliable it was. GE was beginning to look like a big joke. For all its spending and hard work wooing customers, all it achieved was a distant second place behind GM. The company had even failed to take out its former partner turned competitor Alco, although the company was well on its way to doing so. The unfortunate fact was, for the time being at least, all GE had to show for its efforts, besides the distant second place in the market, was a lot of red ink. Remember all the cash it was shelling out to customers to keep them happy when their products didn't quite perform up to standards. GE, however, would not give up the fight easily and would continue to improve the FDL-16 for power output and reliability, although it was going to be a very long and rough road for the company. And that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down. If you really liked the video, please subscribe, as that will help me greatly. Thanks again for watching, and as always, keep the metal side down.